I'm Sandhya Iyer from the HR department. For those of you who don't know me, I also happen to be on the board of the St. Chamber of Commerce, and we started this roundtable, as you know, just to sort of exchange ideas on typical issues that many of us might be coming across in our day-to-day work. Oh, there she is. Rose is there. We've got a list of questions that have been sent over to Catherine, and we are just going to be going through that list, but we don't have to stick to it. It's not sacrosanct. Once we've kind of gone through the questions, if anybody else thinks of anything, then just please feel free to shout. Can everybody hear me all right? All good? All right, good. Yep. Lovely. So the topics we've got today, one of the questions is there any news on a new employment law bill? Mental health and well-being, we don't have a specific question on that. Development and diversity, again, we don't have a specific question on that. We've got another one on CCTV usage policy, and then a phased return to work after long-term sickness. Does anybody have any preference on how we go about this, or no? No, all right, okay. I think we've discussed, the last session was about mental health and well-being. We've also discussed phased return to work after long-term sickness. I was just thinking, would it be all right for everyone if you just picked up something new, such as a CCTV usage policy? Is that all right? Whose question was it anyway, Catherine? Do we know? Catherine? It's fine. Okay. So firstly, I mean, in which sectors are we coming across a CCTV footage policy being used? Because I know some sectors tend to use it and some don't. Anybody has any experience on these things?
I've got a public sector client that it's not CCTV as such, it's more dash cam, so similar, but not exactly the same. But I have got a private client who it's an automotive business, and they have CCTV because of the high value of the equipment and the things that they work on for their clients. So yeah, both sectors, really.
And do you find that you have to also use it as part of your privacy notice then, Roz? You've got to kind of outline it there as well.
I don't know that they've got that far. I think the public sector one does, but the private sector, despite our best efforts, has not included it in their privacy policy as such. They've got a specific CCTV policy, I think. Right. They have. I think they've got. They have a GDPR expert that they use, that's the wife of someone that works there, so they tend to revert to her for that.
What a title.
Yeah.
I mean, in my experience with some of the clients that I've got them in, so we've obviously got them in the care sector, we've got them in one who deal with a lot, many mechanical parts which go into machines, into machinery and cars. So they've got CCTV because of just, like you said, very high value stock all the time. But in my experience of businesses, neither of these businesses, touch wood, have had any problems of having to use it with regards to staff. But in my experience of having to use it in the past, I've found, and that's not going back a very long time, just about a couple of years ago, it's always a bit clunky to get any kind of snippets out of it, because they just say it keeps running, it stays alive only for about 14 days. And apparently if you don't retrieve it in 14 days time, then you can't really use it. That's one thing. But the second aspect is you've got to download it and save it as a separate file, because if you're going to be using it as any part of any investigations or disciplinary, it's got to go all the way through the process. You can't just introduce it somewhere in the middle and just offer the manager to say, I've seen it, this is what I've seen, what is your answer? The idea being it's got to be shared as much as we would share, sort of any other pieces of information as part of the investigation. So have you hit any problems like that, and how have you overcome? Has anybody had that problem in terms of, one, being able to extract that information from a CCTV, and two, where sort of managers have seen it and then they've not bothered to save it, and then having to have that conversation saying we can't really have that as part of the process because you're not able to share it now with the employee. Anybody
I'll give any view on in a work context. All I know is that if you just want more capacity, just put in bigger memory chips. Most systems you can just plug in bigger memory chips and then it will record for a month, 2 months, whatever. So it's just usually a memory issue.
That's interesting.
I repeat,
I think you have to have a policy about how all the details of how long footage is kept, don't you? I think, and I'm sure I remember something about making sure that in your policy it says that it can be used as part of an investigation into a disciplinary, because if you don't, then it's a challenge. But there's also the logistical challenge of what you do about other people that are in the footage in a particular clip, because that's their personal data, and so you end up having to try and work out how the hell you redact an image of another person. And
unless they consent.
It's harder for an IT consultancy who'd be able to do that for you, but
I think Lynn, I mean, we somebody's just mentioned that you kind of give consent where we had that question raised, Roz, and you are right. They just blurred the background, like we are, some of us have blurred backgrounds now, and just it was more the outline of the, IT managed to indicate the respective people within the clip, and it was more the voice you were after. If it's a case of assault and you know who the two people are and you can see movement and you can hear the voice, but they kind of blurred out anybody else was walking past in the background. But yeah, you're right. Again, all of that I find is dependent on how quickly managers act and get back to IT saying, I need this thing extracted, and then you save it.
Yeah.
And the logistical side of it.
If it comes about as a result of an incident, a known incident, and then you use the CCTV to provide, tangible evidence, or if it's a monitoring arrangement, in which case there needs to be specifically covered, doesn't it?
Yeah.
For that reason.
Yeah.
I would have thought as well that the data or the description of CCTV usage and what's collected would be within any standard GDPR privacy policy, and also within a privacy standard, or whatever phrases are used, which is reminding people how they use data. And there will be some people who will have access to it and some who won't. But I'd have thought in most standard policies those would be included because it's a way of gathering data.
Yeah, we have, speaking of CCTV or speaking of video recordings, Rose touched upon this as well. There's some clients tend to have the dash cam installed in company vehicles, and the difficulty again there is some of these vehicles are taken home overnight, and people might drop their children off to school and then come into work. It's about authorizing, or understanding, the employee's rights to be able to switch a dash cam off because they've got family and children in the car, and that's not really directly related to work. Because that's sort of data that's not related to work. So what we've put in place is that obviously when you're doing a school run, you're not still working. You don't clock into work. Just don't clock into work. And at that time you can leave the dash cam off, and only clock in and switch on your dash cam once children have been dropped off. That was kind of an easier thing. However, there are issues where somebody's got to drop something off at another branch en route to a school run. Do you consider that work time or not? So we've had small complications around those sort of areas, and we've just had to look at each case for its own merit. And I think with any policy like this, yes, you can have a policy which addresses blanket expectations, but sometimes things like dash cams, one just has to be really careful and look at individual circumstances, I've found. Yeah. Anyone have anything else to share on that?
I was just going to say, you asked about the sectors, and I've certainly come across it in schools. I've not actually come across it in a wider industry basis from an employer's perspective. I have encountered individuals who have had difficulties because monitoring has been covert and they've not been informed in advance, and they've raised a grievance, so it's become a live issue insofar as that goes. And you know, my understanding is that it's just part of this wider matrix, that it's just part of employee monitoring. So in the same way that if you have a policy to monitor emails, the internet, and so on and so on, you would just, the same sorts of points arise in terms of informing employees and having to comply with the relevant codes, and also ensuring that it's falls within the sort of legitimate interests of the business, because you need that foundation in order to do it in the first place. I think most businesses can do that, provided they can cross that threshold. But I think it's the same with all of these monitoring policies, that you have to be overt, you have to tell people, and if you put it into a policy, you can actually explain that it's both for disciplinary purposes, for any matter, disciplinary grievances, to ensure safety, compliance with legal obligations, the usual sort of myriad points that arise. But you can also get consent in advance, as it were, by sort of introduce it in that way. So hopefully that sidesteps some of the issues that otherwise come out. And I think, as Mike said, you would certainly ensure that it was a privacy statement, sort of front and square, so that everybody knows exactly where they stand on that.
Yeah.
The other thing that we had was, this was of the public sector client who they had a defined process for who and how people would access the material, to make sure that it wasn't just processes in place, it wasn't just access willy-nilly. There was a process of kind of permission from a senior person, and the reason for the access was justified, and so it was all logged.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because you can't just have a situation where a random manager just comes up and says, "Oh, I need to see the CCTV footage for Wednesday at 3 o'clock," because it's.
But again, that would be if you've done. But surely, if you've done your GDPR due diligence review, then it would just be another system, in the same way that you would decide who has access to the CRM or the bank account or the back end of the email system.
It all needs defining, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You can't just say we have a system in place, but it's, until situations come up, it's quite often not something that employers anticipate having to do. And then, and they only phone you when it's an issue. So you're then having to work on the back foot, and then retrospectively introduce policies that can be used from there on in, because they've got themselves into a right pickle, let's say. You can't, sometimes it is really difficult to policy every single potential scenario. You just have to do the best that you can. With the knowledge that you've got, if they don't tell you they've got dash cams in their cars, you can't give them any advice about it, can you? Unless you have like a specific audit. But I'm not a GDPR expert, so I'm not going to pretend that I've got the knowledge to do that. I have somebody that I refer them to.
The other difficulty with any policy, of course, is not just whether or not it's in the policy, but is getting the organisation, whichever they may be, to actually follow the words of that policy, because you can have a policy for anything now, can't you? And if they don't read it and don't understand it themselves, then they're not going to be applying it. So actually applying the policy to whatever is happening is probably one of the difficulties that we face and can't necessarily do too much about.
My daughter, one of them, many jobs that they've had, she was in the fraud company for car insurance. And obviously they use a lot of dash cam images that they probably don't even ask whether they can or not. It's just in the realms of information they can use to find out if people are telling the truth or making a fraudulent claim, which is quite common. And you get drivers getting out of the car, running round to the front of the car, lying down and pretending they've been injured, and it's all caught on the dash cam.
Wow.
That used in a completely different way, but they do, you know, it's out there for companies that have large fleets and also lots of drivers.
That would be covered under legitimate interest, wouldn't it?
Yeah, probably would. It'd be sort of like have a legal aspect to it as well, wouldn't it, if you're trying to make a fraudulent insurance claim?
Yes, they would be complicit, wouldn't they? Because the individual would be making a claim against the employer, who would be making a claim on their insurers. So they would be complicit in that. So they have there's a public policy point that would apply. But presumably their policy is wide enough to hand that information to third parties who would have an interest in viewing it. And again, that's stated and clearly defined from the employer's perspective, that they can give it, say, in this instance, to their insurers or their own third-party investigators.
If something is in public interest, though, wouldn't that fall under whistleblowing? And then, you know, yes, you don't have to your policy doesn't have to explicitly state that, you know, if it is not in the public interest, then we will have to share it with third parties. I think that's a given, isn't it? Even if you don't mention it in your policy, because it's just not in the interest of third party. It's not in the interest of, it's something that is important for public disclosure, and hence in the interest of the public, and hence it has to be disclosed.
Very possibly. Yep. If it's an internal investigation and it doesn't culminate in a perpetration of a fraud, for example, on the insurance company, but it does result in proceedings internally, disciplinary investigations, and any outcome that follows, some of the public policy issues would drop away, but there's still a legitimate interest in the processing and the use of that private data.
Very interesting. Elaine, new employment bill. Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so there's a question on whether there is a new employment bill that's coming into effect. Anyone, any takers on that question?
Well, it's been mentioned. What's it mean?
Pardon?
Can you hear me, Sandhya?
Yes, we can hear. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Did I put it in? I can't remember putting it in. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, we all know that that's not going ahead because the Queen's speech didn't mention it. Well, not because the Queen's speech didn't mention it, but it wasn't in there, which we kind of predicted anyway. And I just thought it was interesting that instead Boris Johnson has appointed somebody to look into work and what they might possibly see that needs to be done. So I mean, it's just tremendously disappointing from my point of view that there's things like the right to request flexible work from day one. You know, they could easily have put that one in, but you know, none, and then there's the leave, is it neonatal leave, can't remember, bereavement leave, something like that. That's you know, these things are easy, but and they would have been vote winners. So let's see what, you know, keep an eye on what Boris Johnson decides to pick up on, because they will hopefully move some of the things forward that they were going to have in the employment bill. I don't think they'll touch the one that's going to enable women who are taking maternity leave to have greater rights in a redundancy situation than they do now. So I think they won't touch that one. But anyway, I thought if anyone had any comments that they wanted to share on things that the government has chosen not to progress, might be interesting. Don't worry if it's not.
I think sometimes when it goes into politics, it just becomes very tricky to even comment, isn't it? Because it's always sometimes at either end of the spectrum. But yeah, it would be an interesting debate.
Well, my guess is that they decided.
Sorry, go
I
on,
was going to say my guess is that they decided that given businesses have had such a tricky time over the last 2 years, they didn't want to rock the boat, and give them more.
That's it, Ros.
Employment shizzle to deal with, for want of a better word. And
yeah,
you know, because
there was lots of time for them to prepare. Yeah.
But so many of the consultations for the proposals in the employment bill have gone through and if not are going through. So I actually think that despite the employment bill as a whole potentially not happening, I think we will actually see quite a few of these changes taking place. I think probably the day one right for flexible working might still make it without an actual employment bill to hide behind. So the consultations are happening. We just don't have the overarching name of the employment bill happening.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Anyway,
Catherine just added saying Jackie had a question on phased return to work after long-term sickness. Jackie?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. Hi. That's actually now been answered. So, but thank you anyway. I found out through CIPD. It's just we've had a member of staff away for nearly 9 months and very keen to come back. But the doctor's note was very vague about what they can and can't do. So we have actually sent them to occupational health now, but thank you.
And has that been helpful with occupational health?
I'm just waiting for the report to come back now. Yes, I think the employee is so keen to come back, which is a really positive sign, especially after such a long time off, which can be very difficult returning to the workplace. We've offered reasonable adjustments and working from home, but they do actually want to be in work. So yes, I'm just awaiting the report now, and we'll put a program together for their a structured approach for them coming back.
Good.
It's positive to hear about employers doing it properly and encouraging the return to work, because so many times you hear about employees on long-term sickness absence only going one way. So it's good to hear about the positive rather than just the negative.
Yes, I mean she's just had a really hard time, to be honest, and hasn't wanted to be off work, but has been through no fault of her own. So yeah.
Well, my husband has also been on long-term sickness absence for almost 2 years now, and went back to the office last week for the very first time, just for one day. And his firm that he works for are definitely one of the examples of a great employer. They've done everything right.
Jackie, for someone who's been off for 9 months, they'll have exhausted statutory sick pay. So are you continuing with company sick pay?
No, that has been exhausted as well. So we are now paying for the hours that she actually works on a phased return until she's back to her full contractual hours. But it then raises the issue of holiday pay. And, you know, there's a lot to consider when they come back and they're not on contractual hours. But yes, all those points are in place to look at until she gets back onto her full hours.
I suppose occupational health will be able to give you that timetable. Sometimes you might see a situation where, obviously in this situation, the employee is, quite keen to return to work, be it for part-time or full-time, but sometimes the occupational health timetable, might not be something that is very palatable for an employee for different reasons. And in that situation, you might find yourself sitting across the table with the employee and working out, based on the framework provided by occupational health and your needs, what would be an acceptable timetable.
Yes.
So we might not be able to implement exactly what occupational health says, but as long as you're giving more than what they've recommended, slightly more, I think you should be fine.
Yeah. Thank you. And
we've got one going on at the minute that's just like that. Somebody's just about to come back. They really want to come back, and it's been supported, but we actually sat down with them and had a long conversation about what had been recommended and what the employee felt was appropriate, because she actually disagreed with what the occupational health advisor had put. They'd suggested starting back 3 days a week, working from 10 till 2, and she said, well, I'm just not going to get anything done, why don't I just do fewer full days? So we've worked constructively with them to produce a phased return over a period of about 8 weeks that makes, suits them and helps them, but also is making sure that it's not overburdening them, too quickly. And the work within what they're going to do is also going to be very strictly managed, so that they don't suffer from overwhelm. Here's your new job back, you're doing it 1 day a week for the next 2 weeks. Well, that's just going to tip someone over the edge, isn't it? So
yes, that's a good point.
There's a balance to be made.
Yeah, if she does end up disagreeing with what occupational health have said about, how she can come back and what she is sort of happy to do, I'll wait and see what the report says and gauge her reaction.
Yeah.
It's always difficult when you have a friction between sort of the medical prognosis or the occupational health recommendations and the employees' expectations and their drive, particularly when they want to come back to work, because allied to that is often the need to start earning again, and supporting a family. And sometimes that oversteps. They become or can become overzealous because of the desire, the need to achieve income. And it's very difficult from the employer's perspective when you have to take a step back and, if you like, be the parental figure and say, no, we're going to have to do this in a slower phased return, even though I understand your desire, but we have to do this in a way that's both cooperative but capable of being monitored, because the impact could be adverse. We've had a couple of instances now which has surprised me, but I think it's linked to a greater awareness of mental health, where we're talking about physical conditions that have been manifest, but at the point of the phased return, and there've been very different circumstances, actually it's turned into sort of a more of a mental situation, because people have been very anxious, and they've been management figures, so that they've been people who are expecting to come back in and sort of take hold of their files and sort of move things forward and sort of deal with sales teams and sort of do all of that sort of stuff, meet and greet and go straight back in and hit the ground running, albeit on a sort of more limited timescale. But they've been very anxious because, firstly, COVID and then illness, and actually they've lost some of those soft skills, the confidence skills, the ability to communicate, and the anxiety has sort of tripped across and exacerbated the physical conditions. I found it quite interesting, but I've been totally guided. I've said from the first, I'm not a I don't do personal injury work, and I'm totally guided by the occupational health recommendations and the clinicians' reports. But sitting in my ivory tower, I found it rather difficult to balance those what can be competing issues.
Chris, mental health and physical health are completely related. So I'm not sure. It's not personal injury necessarily, but anyway, that's my view.
I think there is also a balance to be struck when somebody is in a financial hardship situation, because if their lack of ability to earn money, because you're talking about a phased return being handled in a particular way, could be a source of more anxiety and stress, and therefore the downward spiral becomes more extreme. So it's a really hard balance to strike, because you completely understand you don't want to cause them financial hardship and add to their stress. But at the same time, it has to be, it's a really difficult balancing act to make. And I don't know that there's ever any perfect solution. But I think as an employer, as long as you can show that you've made the decisions for the right reasons and that you've taken into consideration the person's situation and issues, multiple issues, then you've got a basis for a defence there if anything were to unfortunately happen.
I think that's absolutely right. It's that objective justification that you need to sort of be able to perform and hit that test. It's just very difficult when employers are faced with grievances, because employees are pushing very hard to come back, hit the ground running, and they're having to say, we recognise what you're saying, and we understand the frustration, but nonetheless we don't think it's in your interests. We want you back, but we're not going to have you back like that. And that's actually quite a difficult dilemma. And it's all about balance.
I just have a question there. I'm sorry, Sonia, did you want to add something?
Yeah, sorry, I work as a psychotherapist in private practice, so a huge amount of my clients are private clients returning to work at some point when we work through the process, and a positive phased return to work is always really, really valuable to them, but it's something about them feeling included in that process, that they've got some control and autonomy within that as well, because a big theme of anxiety is lack of control, lack of certainty, underestimating their ability to cope, and overestimating what the threat might be. And I think people quite often forget that they can quite easily take on too much before they're ready. So the phased, I find with clients time and time again, a good positive phased return to work is so valuable to build that confidence back up, to help them build those soft skills back up, and to feel part of work again, which is, you know, it's great for people to be back at work. It just adds so much meaning to them, which again in turn is good for their mental health.
I think also having kind of regular reviews about how the phased return is going is extremely beneficial, because you might have a plan, but the plan might not actually suit the realities. And so the constant sort of review and monitoring and how it's going and making adjustments as you go is another aspect that I certainly talk to my clients about when they're talking about a phased return to work.
Yeah. And I had a client recently who sort of was kind of over personalizing perhaps some of the issues with the return to work, and I did sort of point out, I was like, you actually have a contract with your employer. They need you to provide something as well as you wanting them to provide something for you, and it's just keeping that perspective. And I think perhaps the support of therapy comes in with that, so that people can see actually there are two sides to this.
Yeah, well said.
Going back to some of the points that Chris and Roz both have raised, you know, where we have a situation where an employee wants to come back to work, but then occupational health kind of puts the brakes or whatever be it. And, you know, there's always this concept that when an employee is ready, willing and able to work, they have to be put out to work. And if you don't put them out to work, you know, in that particular situation, then you still got to pay them. And what happens when just going back to this example, because I had this case, and it's where you question that whole thing of ready, willing, and able to work. This individual, you could tell, was ready, or rather was willing to come into work. He was ready to come into work, but he clearly wasn't able to come into work. He'd had surgery, hip surgery, and he was just in quite a bit of pain. And and it was a very, very physical job, you know, with just being out in the green and doing things. And that situation where the individual is not able, and you can see it so clearly, occupational health has given you a timetable, and you know that given the demands of the job, maybe he could do with a slightly longer timetable of returning to work. How do you have that conversation around, you know, not just extending that timetable for phased return, but even around pay elements? Because not all small businesses are able to afford to just pay full pay when an individual is clearly not able to do the job or the hours that they're required to do. So how would you have that argument where you're very clearly able to see that somebody is not able to do the job? And that's not performance.
Go back to occupational health.
Yeah.
Occupational health, given out, in this situation, occupational health gave out a timetable. We went back to occupational health and said, look, we as managers can see that, you know, this person is really in pain, so can you review your timetable? But that you're talking about another week before all that comes back, or 2 weeks before all that comes back, and you end up, and it's just the clock is ticking. You know, what do you do with this individual who is just struggling and not able to cope with the timetable given by occupational health, but just wants to get on with it and do it, like we said, to pay his bills? It just gets really tricky.
You could be in danger that they're not safe in the workplace as well, so you have to take that into consideration. So if it's physical and then that they have an accident at work,
absolutely,
you know, you're then liable for a duty of care, not looking after your employees.
Yeah, all that's there. And I think it's about getting that individual to understand that, send them back home. And the question came down to, okay, we're sending you back home. And yes, we have to wait for another review of your occupational health timetable, return to work timetable, but what happens to your pay element and joy when we're sending you back home? Because you're right, we can see that there is a risk here and you're not able to carry out this job. Occupational health has to review your phased return to work timetable. So we were stuck there. It was about 14 days before. And 14 days is a lot of money for a small business to figure out what to do. What would you pay? Would you not pay? It was one such situation. We were, and yes, this employer did end up paying full pay during that time when the occupational health had to review the timetable. But I just think that's just not ideal for a small business owner.
I think every situation is always going to be different, but I also think there's an element of I think there's also a balance to be taken about not taking an overly paternalistic approach. And if an employee who's a grown-up says, I want to come back to work, their hip may be hurting, but the reason they may want to come back to work may be other elements, that they're fed up of being stuck at home and they're feeling isolated, all of those things. So I think a lot of times it's the questions you put to occupational health, which is how do we get this person to work, rather than should this person come back to work? And I think it's a very different dynamic, and it's about making occupational health work for you. In my experience of using occupational health, you have to be directive and prescriptive about what your outcome, so what's the desired outcome? Because the desired outcome of a GP is very different to the desired outcome of an occupational health person. So I think we should start off with trusting employees. I mean, if you've got the Monty Python-esque situation of it's just a flesh wound, then probably that's not ideal. But that aside, I think I think I've always taken the view you need to start with trusting the employee to know what is best for them, unless it is blindingly obvious otherwise.
Yeah, I think this was one of those exceptional situations, Mike, where it was just pretty obvious on the ground, where it was just so physical and he was just really struggling. And the manager said, I don't feel comfortable putting him out. It's going to land on my head. And you could see it. You could see why.
But then the discussion is, well, you can come back to work, but you're not able to do the job. So we can't pay you if you can't do the job. So if your job is climbing ladders and your leg's in a cast, but you want to come back to work, then it doesn't work. But that's a different discussion. That's a capability discussion.
But have lighter duties. What about that? We haven't mentioned that. I mean, there's obviously this duty of care
Other
thing,
work.
but people coming back to work, there might be some other way that they could do that job. And so, I mean, I'm sure occupational health should cover that off, but often, you know, suggest to them that they have got some other an adjusted role for them temporarily.
Yeah, which is what we did. Which is what we did. I mean, even though it was there in the report, I think the question here was about how to fill that gap of the 14 days before we got that clarity back based on this updated, you know, situation when the employee got back to work and was still struggling. So no, it was interesting. So somebody there had a question. I think I wanted to add a comment. Was it Sonia? Was it yourself? I don't know who it was. I heard someone from the right-hand side of my screen. Anyway.
I mean, the trouble, sorry, just, I was going to say that the trouble with these issues is that the sort of generic approach that we'd like, that would fit very well for us in terms of evaluating and considering and then sort of advising upon these issues, is that one size just doesn't fit all. They're very case specific, and it's quite right to say light duties. Outside my window on the other side of the building, somebody's outside on scaffolding painting the outside of the window, and they've got to climb up a ladder and they've got to carry paint, and as Mike says, if they're in a cast, they can't do that, or they can't do that safely, whereas if I perhaps had broken my leg or I was recovering from hip operation, perhaps I could have an adjusted desk and I could be told, if I needed to be told, you must take regular breaks, so you're not just sitting down all the time, but you're getting up and you're, you know, patrolling slightly, and so every case is slightly different, but where I think the difficulties are is that the employer is having to make these decisions, and often the employer doesn't have the skill set necessarily, and has to be guided by occupational health. It doesn't help sometimes when the GP's notes say may be fit to return to work. All of these sort of factors sort of overlap, don't they? And somebody often has to make a hard decision. And I think Mike's right. Sometimes you do have to separate out somebody's willingness to work and their potential willingness to put themselves at risk or to slow down their recovery or whatever it might be, and their entitlement to work, and equally their entitlement to be paid, or paid the normal rate of remuneration. So all of those sort of points get sort of jumbled up, given a good shake, and then sort of picked over, don't they? It's a very difficult area.
Yeah, I wonder if there's if you're waiting on an occupational health report, there's a transparent conversation to have with the individual directly and say, look, you're clearly in pain doing X, Y, and Z. We are concerned that your recovery is going to be hindered. Therefore, we think that we need to review the situation. And so, you know, you need to go home until we've got further information. Or there are these light duties, if they can be identified by the employer. So, and we can, you know, we can have that. If the time frame works on a similar basis, so if they're on a phased return, presumably they would only be working part of the time anyway. So it's not like it's full pay for every day of the week. Because if they're in a phased return, perhaps they were only ever going to be working 2 days a week during that time.
Yeah.
And if you can fill that time with something that, you know, on the face of it looks like it would not cause them such a physical problem to do it, that's an alternative. Obviously, if that alternative doesn't exist, then
which is the problem here, because it was such
the options are limited.
Yeah, I think when it's such a heavy duty operational job, a bit like what Chris was saying, you know, you've got scaffolding and painting. But in this, you know, situation, somebody being, you know, a greenkeeper and just being able to do a specific role as a greenkeeper, and there's no office roles, there's no jobs in the bar for this person to do, and it was just really getting tricky to even, they were back for 3 days a week, and it was just getting really tricky to fill those 3 days a week with so-called light duties or alternate duties or reasonable adjustments. Everything had been done, but it was something I've never come across before. So it was just interesting. No,
it's tricky because you realise the impact you're going to have on that individual if you say, right, you have to go and we're not going to pay you. That's the you know, it's not a nice thing to have to do. But as Mike says, you need to remove that overly sentimental aspect and just look at it from a legal perspective.
As we all have to, you know, end up doing, and absolutely hated for, isn't it? in our roles.
If there is no balance to be struck and agreed, there's not much else you can do, is there? Apart from putting that person in what you feel is physical peril, or it's going to damage their recovery. So it's the worst, you know, the best of the worst options, you know.
I mean, the overarching concern, I think, if you adopt that sort of parental approach, it is to have an open and transparent approach. But the obligation is one-sided on the employer to operate a safe system of work and to ensure that the work environment is used safely, and that will to some extent dictate the approach then that you're able to follow through, because if it's proportionate and it looks reasonable dealing with the circumstances, you're not going to go far wrong. I would hope. I always hope for myself anyway. It always comes down to that balance, and sometimes that you're trying to balance what are competing interests. It's
many times actually. Interesting. Anyone has anything else to add to that? No. Catherine, we've got a couple of points. One on development and diversity. Was there any specific question on that? Look at the chat box. She's got some points there.
She's not on the call. Whoever asked about that topic.
Okay.
And I know Sonia was interested in anything to do with mental health, as that's her area of expertise.
Sonia, did you want to add anything there, or anything?
Sorry, I didn't realise I had a specific agenda item there. No, I've just come along because for me it's very interesting with the work that I do. I work as a private psychotherapist, as I said, with clients and support them through the point where they leave work because they're not well. Something's going wrong for them. Usually we see anxiety, depression, but increasingly, work with trauma and all sorts of other conditions as well. But it's for me, the really joyful part is when they're feeling well enough to return back to work. And I've, over the last 2 years, really become quite interested in sort of how do we support people so they don't feel they need to leave work altogether, if at all possible, and they can get that support and stay in the workplace. So that's really why I came along. To that end, I've been working with some businesses, lunchtime sessions and that sort of thing, as well as mental health first aid training and various other things. So yeah, that's why I'm here. Yeah.
Lovely. So talk to us a little bit about what you do with your sort of, I mean, obviously not stepping onto confidential matters, but what sort of activities do you engage in during lunchtime break, sort of things that you do with staff?
Yeah, well, the clinical one-to-one work that I do with clients is around using cognitive behaviour therapy, which is a really evidence-based approach and we get very, very strong results. Sort of people can come in feeling quite suicidal and they can leave feeling like they're able to live the life that they want to live. And the difference between CBT and other employee assistance programs is that we do have the evidence base. We can measure outcomes, and that's both quantitative, qualitative as well, and show that people are able to be back in the workplace and be productive again. In terms of the lunchtime sessions, anything, resilience was a big theme that was coming through, just working with companies, tailoring those sessions to companies, to whatever was needed. So managing stress, managing anxiety, resilience work for people, you know, return to work. Lots of people are resistant to coming back to working in the office. Other people can't wait to get into the office, and the various dynamics that go with that. So working with that on the mental health. Just quite keen in terms of prevention, because most of my work takes place in terms of treatment when people are ill. So it's wanting to be able to keep people at the health end. And I think the vast majority of the conversations that take place tend to be around well-being. So I'm also a mindfulness teacher, but the mindfulness that I trained to deliver is with Oxford University, which has the remarkable research that mindfulness, the 8-week course, delivered, is as effective as antidepressants for the relapse prevention of depression. So, you know, that's quite a statistic for people. And there's lots of other data that I could quote to you about that sort of thing.
Can I ask a question of you, Sonia?
Yeah.
Do you think, because I've had situations where people have been helped by having someone in the workplace who they can go to, like a mentor, so they can check in with them, who they feel confident to go to, who they identify themselves, rather than it being imposed by the employer that is the person that they see. I think it is really, really helpful for someone returning, or keeping someone in work, particularly people who have high degrees of anxiety and self-doubt and who are prone to depression. That has been really helpful. What do you think about that? And have you recommended that to employers or anything like that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's why mental health first aiders, I think, became very popular.
Yeah.
But again, that's an employer dictated method of support. And I think I'm very interested in it actually just being a culture in work of how to get the best out of people, how to support people, how people can flourish. We've got so much work that we do in terms of treatment. But it's also, not everybody needs to be ill. Sometimes people just hit a bit of a bump and come off track a little bit. Yeah. And it's about those things that make us vulnerable as people and versus the things that protect us as people. And I think, yeah, exactly that, you know, the ability to have somebody in work that they can go to, that they can speak to, and really going with the idea that, you know, we can have a diagnosis, but if our needs are met, then we're no longer disabled. By that diagnosis, we're not ill because of that within the workplace or anywhere else. So I'm very keen to.
Sonia, there's lunchtime sessions then. Are those kind of group sessions for a certain number of employees who come in and have a session with you as sort of as part of the preventative kind of employers kind of measures to help reduce things getting to a point of crisis?
Yeah, exactly. So one company I was working with was an engineering company, and it was just across the staff board. The company was growing very quickly, and they wanted to create the right culture, the right ethos. Staff were feeling supported, but at times were under a huge amount of pressure because of the sustainable engineering company. So it was rapidly growing, for example. So staff were under pressure, and there were just little simple things that they would just be able to, exactly that mentor role, they'd start to be able to talk to each other or feel free to talk to each other, and it was the right environment, or they could, you know, somebody could step out and take a moment, or take a proper lunch break, or just all sorts of little things that they'd be able to start to be able to support each other with. Because I think one of the things I like most about cognitive behaviour therapy, people don't just come in, put their feet up. It's a collaborative relationship between therapist and client, and it's proactive. And the whole idea is that somebody leaves feeling like they're their own, they're the they're their own therapist, that they can provide therapy for themselves going forward. And it destigmatizes it because it is evidence-based, and we do have treatment protocols. So to be able to bring that attitude into workplaces so it becomes truly sustainable in terms of people being sustainable in the workplace, rather than the crash and burn that so often I see in the therapy room, would be really lovely to see.
Learn something new there
Great
today.
work.
Sandhya. Very interesting. Yeah, really interesting.
Well, you know, 1 in 4 people experience depression or anxiety. And by 2030, the World Health Organization seem to think that's going to be the leading cause of disability, over and above physical disability. And they're pre-pandemic figures. So when you think about, you know, what's happened over the last 2 years, you know, I think there's very few people who haven't had a wobble at some point, or worse. And also so many people have been left alone in their heads. And, you know, a real feature of both depression and anxiety for depression, it's about rumination, which is about that backward thinking, whereas like anxiety is very much about overthinking. And both of those are achieved by our first intervention with depression is about behavioural activation, getting people active, you know, meaningful contact, meaningful activities. So to, you know, in my view, to completely remove somebody from a workplace or remove that from their lives can be beneficial sometimes, but to bring that back in is also highly beneficial. So, yeah.
So, Sonia, may I ask, do you see a differential, very broadly, in terms of age demographics? Because my experience latterly is that younger people generally much younger than myself, are very astute to recognize the balance between physical and mental health. They understand the alignment, and they are not shy at all awkward in coming forward to say to employers, to line managers, I'm struggling, that I need some assistance, whatever that might be. But older employees who often experience more difficulties because they're at a different stage in their lives, so there may be more financial problems, the wider family problems, and so forth, possibly with parents, older parents above them, children below them, often as a bigger sort of cocktail of issues, but they're more reticent about stepping forward. They see it as you talked about, stigma, and it's a weakness. And I wonder whether society has changed, or it's just a very narrow experience that I'm getting through employers reporting back to me, because I'm not taking a poll test. I'm just sort of advising on situations. But I wonder if you feel that there is a difference in that younger generations are very much better able to express themselves.
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think I see a cross-section of both. I think when people do come into the therapy room who are older, yes, it's, you know, they are perhaps more upset about it, but I think any mental ill health is quite distressing for anybody to get to the point where they think that. And maybe that's a cultural thing in the UK. Other cultures, other countries have different attitudes towards it. I'm not sure. But I think it's hard for anybody to recognise, actually, I'm in crisis here, I'm finding this really, really difficult, and I'm not feeling like I've got the skills to be able to cope with certain things. That, you know, it's just distressing for whatever age group. I think one of the things I'm always very, very keen to point out to people when they do come in is, you know, you're only human, and when nobody's perfect, and we all hit a bit of a bump on the road, and that idea that there are things that protect us in life, things that make us more vulnerable, and quite often people will have a series of things that will hit them before they actually come into the therapy room, and they've got a number of things that have knocked them off course and brought them in, and it's just regrouping and being able to a healthy dose, a very heavy dose sometimes, of compassion and kindness, and just helping them to realise that there's a lot that they can still do, and how they can, have that control back in their lives, and they can control their lives and take that time out. I think the other thing that people do think with mental health, and I'm always keen to sort of talk to clients about it as well, is when they go off, they're sick. So therefore I've got to sit around, I've got to be sick. And that maintains the problem. So actually with mental health, if we think about, depression, behaviour and activation, what I need them to be doing, can you go for a walk every day? Can you see somebody? Can you be in contact with somebody? Can you go to a shop every day? What can you do each day to be re-engaging in life, and really sort of bringing in that's a sense of achievement, because our brains want to hold negative information over and above the positive, something we call negativity bias. And, I think older people have got maybe more history and, more propensity to do that, perhaps. But no, it's just, I don't think there is a massive age differential, but perhaps there is a perception that I've got to be ill if I'm off sick.
Just Sonia, that's really interesting.
Really interesting.
Very, very interesting. I think we are going to be connecting with you. I think almost one-to-one. Many of us. I'm just conscious of the time. It's been really interesting. It's been another really good session. So thank you so much to everyone who's been able to attend today. And yeah, we're just going to keep this going once every 2 months. So please definitely diarize this, and you're welcome to sort of join us in the future. Yeah, and let's all stay in touch anyway. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Sandhya.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.